Is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest? Okay, seeing none, we have Laura Dizanat, who is partner with KPMG here to present our consolidated financial statements. So welcome to this one.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, we're going to start with the PowerPoint presentation. So it's going to show up here on this, at least we'll be able to see it. And then I'll run through that. I'm not even sure you'll care about the statements afterwards because everything gets talked about during that presentation. The opinion this year, which is actually 3 pages, it's much longer than it's ever been. This is the first year of the new opinions. So for those of you who've been around a few years, and definitely I see a few faces that I'd seen in prior years, you would have seen a standard report, which used to be 3 paragraphs. And people would look for those 3 paragraphs, and if they weren't there, they'd say, okay, why is the opinion so long? Yours is a plain opinion. It means the financial statements we believe are fairly presented as they appear. However, the new opinions first put the opinion paragraph first, then talks about what the basis is, what our responsibility is as auditors, what your responsibility is, and then the fact that it's basically clean. So that's why it's so long. Please don't be nervous about the fact that it is. Then the next page talks about the statement of management's responsibilities. Given the new opinion, it may not be necessary, but every municipality still has that in that, so we've left it in. The first page with numbers is the statement of financial position. This is your snapshot at a point in time, and the reason that I said you may not even care if we go through the statements, what I decided we would do a couple of years ago is put all the highlights for what the variances were on the statement of financial position and the statement of operations right on these pages so that you have them as a bit of a reference then to look at. Now your cash is down, still quite a healthy balance at 6.9, but down from the balance last year because you spent more in capital this year than you have in some time. You had major additions, and we'll go through those in a few minutes. You did get some grants to cover parts of those, however, not as much as you got in, as you paid for these capital assets. And so as a result, you've utilized a bit of your cash here. Now you use more than the million, but when we get down to accounts payable, you're going to see that the payables are up also then for holdbacks, et cetera, that are in there. If we slip down, you'll see a kind of a bit of an increase there in grants receivable. There's a bit of an amount outstanding for the connecting link and water main then at year end. You'll see the investment in government business enterprise has gone up then by the amount that you would have expected this year. And the increase is detailed in quite some detail in the note to the financial statements that talks about this. Of course, by the time we are here and having this discussion next year, I expect that you will have converted that into investments. So then down to accounts payable and accrued liabilities, we talked about the capital. There's some capital sitting in there. The disbandment costs are sitting in there, and the holdbacks then. Long-term debt is inching its way down because of you've had 1 year's worth of payments. So despite the increased capital that you paid for this year, you didn't borrow to do so. So you've just got 1 year's worth of long-term debt coming down then. Deferred revenue, what's in there this year is memberships that were in there last year for your facility, and a bit for the Main Street grant. Last year you had OCIF money in there that hadn't been earned yet. Now when you see the deferred revenue obligatory reserve funds, this is basically your gas tax money. So it's separated then so that you can keep track of it separately. So the amount that you had for gas tax then this year went in there, as well as the interest that you earned on it. You keep it all separate, less the amount that you had put in the budget this year then that you were going to take out of that fund for the connecting link and wastewater upgrade. Post-employment benefits, that amount is down somewhat because you don't have the police employees then at year end. Their component of those post-employment benefits have come out of that obligation. Down to tangible capital assets, you will see that you're up basically a net of 3.8 million. That reflects about 5.8 in capital asset additions, less then you've got some disposals and you've got your amortization. So the net of those numbers then are what you see there. What's in your 5.8 million in additions? The biggest chunk of them have been listed there, although we can go through a few extras if you'd like. The capital additions include phase 2 then, the 2.1 million. Your Highway 6 amount of money is 2.8, and the fire hall is 837. I broke it down a little bit more on another page, which is just two coming, just to make you have to wait a little bit longer and hold your breath in anticipation. Now, prepaid, I mean, I never speak about prepaids, but it was up 100 grand, and I thought you might care about that. Your insurance, you paid just before year end then, just after last year. So it really was a timing thing, ladies and gentlemen. And land held for resale, those parcels that used to be sitting up there in accounts receivable, that period of time has gone by, and those parcels that you were holding have now been moved into land held for resale. Now, on to statement of operations. The biggest two changes that you see here when you look down, so this statement shows all of the activity for the year. I know you remember that from our little discussion that we had about a month ago on what's in these statements. So it compares year over year as well as year to budget so that you can see what the differences are. I know it looks kind of small up there on the screen, but the big changes when you look at them, I mean, taxation looks very similar. The amounts deducted for school board, very, very similar. Grants and contributions, though, you got 3.4 million in capital funding this year that you didn't get last year. You had expected some of that, so that is sitting there in the budget as well. So if you look then, you'd expected even perhaps to go further than that with this. So last year you had 3.2 in grants, this year 7.3, and as I say, 3.4 of it is capital for those two big projects. The two, that is the water main and phase 2A there. So down to, other. I thought I should focus just for a second there on licenses and permits because obviously it's up quite a bit from last year. That's the new school. Down to expenses, there's only one significant variance, and that is associated with protection services, and the costs associated with this pandemic then are there. Bringing you down then to, last year you had 451,000, then for the bottom line this year, 2,099,000. Now this is because, folks, while you got that 3.4 in capital grants, the fact that you spent 5.8 doesn't show up there until you depreciate those assets. So this is all a timing thing. You only had 1.8 in amortization this year, so that's going through these statements. You spent 5.8. So the fact that you got the 3.4 you see in capital grants, this is why you're sitting here with this nice surplus that shows up for the year. It isn't it's because the grants are not amortized in the same manner that the assets are. Statement of changes in net financial assets. This takes you from your surplus down to what net financial assets did you have at the beginning of the year, and then what have you got at the end of the year. So we talked about acquisition of tangible capital assets, and I wasn't lying to you. You'll see it's 5.8 up there. And those additions we talked about then, the new fire hall, Highway 6, Phase 2A. Oh, and then there were a few others that I told you I was making you wait on. There was some fire, like breathing apparatus for the fire people, and the new handy bus. So those little goodies are sitting there in the additions as well. Now, the next page shows what makes up your accumulated surplus. You will remember when we had our discussion about what's in your statements. And my comment to you was, like at the beginning of the year then, we were looking at last year's, if you'll recall, and the number of the year was 52 million. And I said, that does not mean you have 52 million that you can spend on the municipality, because as you will see there, you have this year 46 million, last year 42 in equity in your tangible capital assets. And my famous line, and you'll remember it from when we had our presentation on these financial statements, was, you can't eat your furniture. So that is, in your case, there's not much of it that's furniture. It's mostly roads and buildings and that sort of thing then that you have. And now you have a fire hall, and you have a beautiful recreation complex. You have all those goodies. And the equity is sitting there in that $46 million number. You do have reserves, however, of $4.5 million, and that's more of what you can eat. And then you have your government business enterprise, which is currently being carried at $4 million on your books. So then, as I promised you, we have comparative analysis again this year. And this seemed to go over fairly well. And I am going to give some credit where credit is due on this one. When we were going through this, I sent the comparative analysis then to your team, your management team. And they said, well, this can't be right. Because now, not this page, but moving on, this can't be right. I paid, taxes both here in Espanola, and I paid them in Central Manitoulin. Last year, you told me it was that we were here. This year, it's there. And honestly, I'm going to tell you that when I heard this, I said, yeah, sure, okay, And so I checked with the young gentleman who prepared this document, and he said, well, I'm sure I did it right, but let me check. He checked. She was absolutely right. There was school taxes were sitting here in the Espanola number, and they weren't in any of the others. It was pulling the wrong number out of the FERB. Well, he had aligned it to pull it by mistake. So I wanted you to realize, wow, somebody knows their numbers in this building. That person's behind me here. Anyway, we use the same comparatives that we used last year. And the reason for those comparatives were they were single tier. They're all here in Northern Ontario, and they had a similar number of households. Now, you're going to look at it and say, well, what in the heck have you got West Nipissing for? Last year we pulled them as well because they were a similar type of town as what we had thought. But that darn West Nipissing has gone and got a whole bunch of neighboring municipalities and pretty much incorporated them in. I know we are about 40 minutes from there, and yet we're considered West Nipissing. So, I'm afraid the households are not really what I think of when I think of Sturgeon Falls, but nonetheless, we left it in there so that you could see it. And a lot of these municipalities have an industry similar to yours, like we threw a few of those in there for that reason. So let's look at what we got. They're a bit different. The comparatives are different than they were last year because we thought we should shake things up a bit. So what you're going to see, ladies and gentlemen, when you look here, the first on the far left is Espanola this year, because we have your FIR numbers for this year. Everything else, we're using last year's numbers because they haven't necessarily uploaded them on, or we have yours because you'd already prepared them. But so the prior years, Central Manitoulin, Cochrane, those are all last year's numbers. I wanted you to be aware if something big happened in one of those municipalities, it is not reflected in those numbers. So first we broke the expenses down by segment. So environmental, general government, health, etc. So that you could give it a little bit of a comparison. And you have, I believe, all of this, isn't that right, in their packages?
Not this presentation, they have the.
Oh, the state night, okay, okay. Then the next one, what we do is take the percentage. So the percentage that environment is out of the total, the percentage that health is out of the total, et cetera, so that you could see where are some of these municipalities spending their money, basically, on what percentage of their money are they spending on what. And this year, of course, you have the high protection because that line is up on a one-year basis. If you look at last year's, it's more aligned with what the balance would be. Now, don't forget, of course, transportation is not, we're not talking bus systems here. We're talking about how much are people spending on the roads, basically. So the next one is expense by type. So we had it by segment, and then just as your notes to your financial statement also break it up into amortization and external transfers, etc. So does this. So this shows how much are salaries and benefits, how much are contracted services, that sort of thing. And then the next one shows on a percentage of out of 100% of the expenses by type. And my goodness, actually most of these are very, very similar on the salaries and benefits, almost go along here at about 45% almost across the board. And then how much of it is amortization, that sort of thing. You may wonder about the amount of purple in a couple of these landfill costs. If there's been a change in the landfill accruals, those go through that one large purple amount there. You don't have such a creature then in
No.
Expenses as a percentage of the tax assessment. So we thought, well, okay, that might be interesting for you to be able to compare then on a year-over-year. You are pretty much in the middle of this group for that. Net debt comparative. Now, when you look at this, you will say, okay, well, some of them are up, some of them are like down below zero. What is the story here? If it's going north, you've got assets, net assets. If it's going south, they have net debt. Basically, they have borrowed for their capital assets. That's more than they have. They borrowed more than they had assets then to cover that current assets. So there's a few, as you'll see, with quite large basic liabilities are in excess of their financial assets. Then the other one I thought you might be interested in is the reserve fund comparative. So this shows, your discretionary reserves, your general surplus, your obligatory reserves, which really that's your gas tax balance then sitting there, then and the rest of your reserves. So there are some, without a doubt, with some pretty high reserve balances. I think that the one with the highest has a very large group of residents that are there just for a few months of the year. There's not a lot of service they necessarily have to provide in that specific area. The next one I thought, now we were throwing around ideas as to what might be interesting. This is a ratio of your capital additions to your amortization. So basically, if your amortization is what's the average that you're going to be, if what they say is that the amortization should give you an idea of what you need to put away for capital assets. This year, however, you spent 200, as you can see there, about 275% of what that amortization is, which is true. We did the math there, and whereas last year you spent, what does that look like? About 35%. So much, much less than you did this year on that. Now, there's one group that still beat us then this year. They had to have a very expensive year, and of course others which were close behind. I just thought you might find it interesting on a comparative basis. A number of the rest you're just going to find you fit nicely tucked into the middle of some of these. Taxation per household, this one is. So there are a few more than you, a few really very close, and a few less. So, and then the next one is taxation as a percentage of household income. And I would say you are right a little on the low side, really, in this one. There's a few that are really quite high, and then there's about 4 of you there that are virtually identical, and then a few lower. Taxation as a percentage of assessment, which again, there are a few that are high, and then my goodness, look at how consistent a bunch of the rest of those are this year. Long-term debt to households. So that this is basically how much does every household in your municipality, what's their share of all of the debt for the municipality. And here's what it is. And this number, when you look at the federal or provincial government, are kind of scary, actually. However, I'm sure they won't hopefully be asking me for my share today. Debt service cost to revenue. I thought, again, this was interesting. This is the interest and the principal, then on a relative basis to your total revenue. Net book value to the cost of assets. Now, this one, what is this telling us? If it was bang on 50%, then what it would say is you are replacing your assets on an absolutely consistent basis. Yours are at a little over 60%. So basically, your capital assets are slightly newer than the average. So if you said that your building was going to last 40 years, on average, then instead of the buildings being 20 years, they are on average only 16 years. That is what this specific graph is telling you. You'll see some of them are below the 50 there, and some are above the 50. And that was what I thought would be interesting for you. Now, again, ladies and gentlemen, please know this is what we throw together thinking, what will people find more interesting than me just telling them why cash is up and why payables are up? If there are specific comparatives that you want, specific items that you think, gee, I wonder what we are on a comparative basis for this specific ratio, please feel free to let us know. Because we do mull it over every single year and see what we think people will, and we change it up. Like, you'll notice that it's different this year than it was last year.
Any questions?
Yeah.
Councilor Johnson?
Okay, I'm looking at the consolidated statement of operations and accumulated surplus.
Yes.
Okay, down under the expenses, the budgeted amount for protection services was 6.2,
Mhm.
but the actual was 6.6. Now, you said the difference between 17 and 18 was because of the police disbanding in there?
Yes.
The difference between the budget and the actual, what do you think that was from?
There are a couple of things in there. Now, don't forget that you don't budget for depreciation, your amortization.
Okay.
But it is in the actual. And then your disbandment wasn't bang on budget either.
Okay.
Yeah.
So mostly it was depreciation and
Disbandment, yes.
And again, when I look at the transportation services, the budgeted amount was 2.1 and the actual was 2.8.
Once again, your depreciation not being budgeted.
Okay, so is this something that should be budgeted, is the depreciation?
It is not common for municipalities to budget for their depreciation. You have started to get into it in some manner, and you have some items that are that are consistent, and you've got them in there. But it is not common to be. For very large municipalities, Marie, they do budget for depreciation, but those are not normally cities, truthfully, with like where that's someone's job to do that.
Yeah, there's just such a large
Swing,
yes between the budget and the
Yes.
actual. There's an awful lot
Yeah.
in there. I had one other question. On your notes to the financial statement, note number 14 under budget, I don't quite understand what it is you're telling me there.
What we're telling you is, this is what council approved for the budget, and this is where the budgeted surplus comes from then. So you, instead of budgeting for depreciation, you have a capital budget, 9.4 million. So then, where were your expenses? If you take those out, transfers to other funds, your actual capital expenditures, then that sort of thing, that's where you had, this is what you budgeted instead of budgeting depreciation and amortization.
Okay, so when you're saying the budget was prepared on a modified accrual basis, while Canadian public sector accounting standards require the full accrual basis.
Yes.
So, is this common that we do this?
This is very common. This is what, basically every municipality has a capital budget, an operating budget, and then they budget for monies to come in and out of the reserves.
Okay, so that's because of the way we do it. We don't have to follow GAAP then when we're doing this?
Not when you're doing the budget. Because you need to budget for what are you going to spend your money on capital, like for capital. Whereas otherwise you would be going through and recalculating what your amortization on all those assets was going to be. You don't know how many of them you're going to get grants for. Some of them you're only going to buy if you do get a grant, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
Those were good though.
Okay, seeing no other questions, we do have a resolution moved by Councilor Foster, seconded by Councilor Duplessis. Be it resolved that the consolidated financial statements be accepted as presented. All in favor? That's the majority, so that's carried. Thank you for your presentation.
You're very
We appreciate you coming to do this work.
No problem.
Okay, we have one more motion that is going to adjourn the meeting. It is moved by Councilor Dufour, seconded by Councilor Duplessis. Be it resolved that the special meeting of council is hereby adjourned at 6:59 p.m. All in favor? And that is carried. Bye, thank you for coming.
Delighted.